The domestic political turmoil between supporters of President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. and Vice President Sara Duterte is continuing. The ongoing domestic political turmoil between the two office holders has not diverted attention from China's external threat in the West Philippine Sea. This underscores the need for the Philippines to avoid becoming overly focused on its internal political struggles, especially when an aggressive China continues to encroach on Philippine sovereignty and other nations in the South China Sea. And the US is changing administrations. The Japanese Foreign Minister Takeshi Iwaya met with Philippine Foreign Minister Enrique Manalo last week in Manila to discuss the security situation in the West Philippine Sea and the South China Sea, and both countries shared concern over Chinese aggressive territorial claims. This meeting happened after President Joe Biden, Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba, and Philippine President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. held a virtual meeting as part of their trilateral arrangement. The foreign minister meeting in Manila reaffirmed the message from the call between Japan and the Philippines, indicating that the U.S. remains committed to the rules-based order security arrangements in the Western Pacific to counter China, particularly given Japan's statement that the security situation is becoming increasingly severe. At a press conference with Mr. Manalo, Mr. Iwaya affirmed the commitment of Japan and the Philippines to their bilateral alliances, their bilateral security ties with the US, and their trilateral cooperation, which isn't a formal arrangement like the two formalized security arrangements they share with the US. Like many other parts of the world, the Western Pacific media has exaggerated the fear that the US may withdraw from its alliances in the region, a concern that foreign ministers have also expressed. The Trilateral Alliance is a loose agreement that the Biden administration put in place, but the bilateral alliances between the US and Japan and the US and the Philippines are not new, and both were in place during the first Trump administration. President Trump's choice for his national security advisor, Mike Waltz, declared in November that he and Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, are in agreement. Given China's reputation for challenging new administrations at the start of their terms, part of this statement aims to prevent China from exploiting the power shift. It is also largely true that the Trump administration will have a different tone than the Biden administration, but it will serve the same basic objectives as before. Since both nations have formal bilateral security agreements with the US, we can expect that these will be the channels through which most of the cooperation will flow, potentially de-emphasizing the importance of the less formal trilateral agreement. There will be two distinct and public messaging changes, and both countries will be expected to contribute to their own defense, something they largely do today, rather than relying on the US to shoulder the majority of the responsibility. We anticipate the US to adopt a more assertive leadership stance, thereby enhancing Japan's and the Philippines' comprehension of the US stance, which officials in Manila and Tokyo have discreetly questioned. This is not to say that the Philippines and Japan do not have legitimate security concerns, as the US administration changes and a new national security team assumes power. The team, which includes Senator Marco Rubio, the nominee for Secretary of State, and Representative Mike Waltz, still needs to bolster their staffs and establish new relationships. Foreign Minister Iwaya will attend President Trump's inauguration on January 20th, allowing him to begin establishing contacts to address the security issues in the Western Pacific that affect both Japan and the Philippines. Foreign Minister Manalo also attended an ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, meeting in Malaysia last week, emphasizing the need for ASEAN to seriously address the ongoing negotiation of a code of conduct for the South China Sea between the bloc and China, which has been ongoing since 2002. Last year, President Marcos Jr. expressed frustration over the lack of progress at the ASEAN meeting in Laos. Mr. Manalo asserted that addressing the milestone issues is crucial to establish the scope and legal binding status of this agreement. The agreement not only impacts the Philippines and China in the dispute, but also Vietnam, Malaysia, and Brunei. Mr. Manalo reaffirmed President Marcos's assertion that China has not discussed, let alone negotiated, the more complex aspects of this agreement, which require attention. The challenge for the ASEAN bloc is that despite the fact that China agreed to negotiate on the issue in 2002, its foreign ministry has a nearly unwavering policy that all disagreements with China over the South China Sea need to be negotiated on a bilateral basis with no third parties involved, which would appear to include ASEAN. As a military and economic superpower, China possesses significant advantages in bilateral negotiations and typically refrains from engaging in meaningful negotiations outside of this framework. This also applies to ASEAN, as evidenced by the lack of progress in negotiations over the real issues in the South China Sea for the past 23 years. Mr. Manalo addressed reporters at the conference as well, saying that the US has not given any indication it will reassess its engagement in the Western Pacific in either scale or in policy. This is taking place against the backdrop of a bilateral meeting, the 10th in a series, between China and the Philippines, with the stated goal of reducing tensions in the region. The Philippines Undersecretary of Foreign Affairs, Teresa Lazaro, met with Chinese officials, where they committed to resolving their differences through consultations and dialogue. This dialogue occurred 2 days after Philippine security officials lashed out at China for deploying a large Coast Guard ship to the Scarborough Shoal and then sent it to within 77 nautical miles, 143 kilometers, of the Philippine coast in an apparent escalation of tensions. The Philippine National Security Council spokesperson stated that China's actions were pushing us to the wall and that all options were on the table, which was more of a reference to legal action and not military action against China. The Philippines reiterated their steadfastness and refusal to yield. Despite the expressed concerns by both Japan and the Philippines about US commitments to the region, both also seem to acknowledge that the security arrangements and guarantees in the region will not change in any fundamental way. Expect the incoming Trump administration to be more confrontational with China in the Western Pacific and on the global stage, thereby increasing the weight of the security arrangements between the Philippines and Japan. The biggest source of frustration that the Philippines will continue to experience is the lack of progress in the ASEAN negotiations with China.